Okay, so this is our continuation of Chapter 6. Where we left off was we talked about island biogeography. I know I got kind of cut off there at the end, but this is definitely a good simulation for you to take a look at if it didn't make sense, because you can manipulate the size of the islands as well as the distance from the islands. And those are the two big things that determine the species richness on an island based on immigration and extinction. So definitely something to take a look at. Now, the other community types of interactions we're going to be looking at are predator-prey and succession, or how ecosystems respond to change. So one of the key things about predators and prey is that they do interact with each other. This is probably one of the key community interactions that we have. And to be a good predator, you have to rely on your senses. So a lot of our predators have really good smell or eyesight or hearing to be able to find those prey. But then again, the prey have to have their own adaptations. So cryptic coloration is another name for camouflage. So here in the picture, you can barely see this flounder. There's its eye, and then it's very well camouflaged into the sand. Another thing you might see is mimicry. So mimicry is pretending you look like another species. So down here, here's a tree snake poised in a tree, and here's a caterpillar that can posture its body to make it look like it's a tree snake. Another thing is warning. So anytime you see any type of bright colors in nature, that's a warning to not eat that, because a lot of times those are poisonous. Now also you can have mimicry of warning colors. So not every bright colored thing you see is poisonous or is poisonous, but it could be mimicking that. And then of course there's hiding and running. Now with predator-prey, you have a very characteristic pattern that happens, that they really kind of go back and forth with each other. So here this blue line is our prey, and our green line is our predators. Now one thing I want you to notice off the bat, that traditionally our prey always has to be higher than our predators. So I want to take you back to that ecological pyramid we talked about in Chapter 3, remembering that shape and that it gets smaller as you go up those food chains, and remembering that it can only support about 10% of the energy or 10% of the biomass as you go up the food chain. So that explains why our prey is typically always bigger than our predators. So here, in order for our predator number to increase, what you have to have first increase is our prey number. So the rabbits have to go up so that the wolves have enough food for their numbers to go up. And then once the wolf numbers go up so high, then the prey number drops. So it's this back and forth that the prey increases, followed by a predator increase, that drives the prey down, and then the predators have to go down. So this is why we have that jog around the carrying capacity, because there's these external forces that are determining both the prey and the predator populations. So it goes back and forth like this. So I do have a simulation, and there is an optional lab that you can do with this. But just to kind of see this in action, here is the blue line is our predator, the red line is the prey. So our prey line has to increase first in order to see our predator go up. So there has to be enough food for our predators. And once that prey peaks, it's followed by that predator peak. And once the predator starts to peak, then that drops my prey low. When my prey gets too low, then my predator gets low. So it's this back and forth kind of give and take of predator and prey populations. So this is one of the key classic community interactions that we have. So I do have some information for you. You can go and do looking at data, graphing some data, and taking a look at wolves and rabbits. That'll be on Google Classroom. I'll also post it on Blackboard because that's a PDF. Now, another thing that happens within communities is that communities will respond to disturbances. So disturbances can be both natural or human caused. Now, sometimes you might have random, periodic, or episodic types of disturbances. So our big episodic ones are things like sea level rise or plate tectonics. I want you to think those as long time scale. Storms and earthquakes are definitely random. And then the things that happen periodically are seasonal changes. So one of like the classic ways that animals will respond to the periodic changing of the seasons is with migration, to follow food sources, to follow weather. Another big thing that will cause them to respond to disturbance is any type of major habitat changes. So they'll either have to respond or they might go extinct. Now, one of big types of disturbance, a classic community reaction that we have is called succession. Now, there are two types of succession. We have primary succession and secondary. Now, there are not many things that lead to primary succession. If you can tell what this picture is showing, this is lava rock. So a volcanic eruption can cause primary succession. The key thing here is with primary succession, you start with nothing. You start with bare rock. There's no soil, there's no seeds, there's no nutrients. You have to start fresh. Whereas with secondary succession, you do have soil, you do have seeds, you do have some remnant of the previous ecosystem left behind. So primary succession is much slower than secondary succession is. One other thing that can lead to primary succession is a glacier retreat. So we're talking about pretty phenomenal events that happen here, either a volcanic eruption or a glacier retreat. Whereas secondary succession, one of the most classic examples is fire. Another thing can be deforestation, clearing land for agriculture, that type of thing. So typically when we talk about succession, we are talking about a plant response. So we'll start with primary succession. The key thing with primary succession is you start with bare rock. So your first step is you have to start to make soil. So you have to have weathering occur. And that can be a physical process, but also you can have things like lichen and moss that will help with the biological weathering of rock. They'll start to use acids that will start to break down rock. They'll start to add some organic material and just the startings of soil for some smaller little grasses to be able to grow. As those die and decompose, they'll add to that soil level, and that's going to help to have smaller bushes that start to grow. Those bushes will start to die and decompose, leaving more organic material in the soil for our fast-growing pines. Now here you start to really have some interaction. Up until this point, you have nothing but pure sunlight. You have no shade. So all of these types of plants are light-loving. They don't need a lot of nutrients because there's not a lot around. But when you start to get trees, they really start to impact the previous community as well as the future one. So pine trees, they are very fast-growing. They do take some nutrients out of the soil, and they create shade. So what they'll do is they will shade out the previous bushes and shrubs. So they'll all start to die, adding their nutrients to the soil. The pine trees also create shade that our hardwoods really like to germinate. So the hardwoods will be able to germinate with the help of the pine trees. And then as the pine trees grow, they are much slower growing, but they can grow taller and they have a much bigger shade canopy. So they will actually shade out these pine trees and kill the pine trees because they need light. And so the end result of a lot of our East Coast communities are these hardwood forests. So once you see that hardwood forest, what you can typically assume is that it has gone through all phases of succession. Now, secondary succession is very similar. The difference is you start with something. So what I need you to imagine is some type of a forest fire that came through and actually added nutrients to the soil. Remember, fires don't necessarily have to be bad. So they're going to kind of refresh the soil. So you start with some type of seed. You definitely have soil, so this makes it much faster. Then you have your perennial weeds and grasses, and you have your fast-growing shrubs. These are all light-loving species, and those help to set the stage for our fast-growing pine trees. They create shade that kills out all of these early species, and they create shade that allows the hardwoods to germinate, and then the hardwoods are germinating and growing, and then they turn around and shade out trees. Now, one important thing to point out is we do have a name for these early species that come, these lichens and mosses and small herbs. We call these pioneer species because they are the first ones to colonize an area. And so these pioneer species, they tend to not need a lot of nutrients. They're definitely generalists. They can grow very fast, and they do need a lot of light. And so the conditions are right for those pioneer species. You also have pioneer species in secondary succession, and they just would be like grasses and weeds. So I do have some practice. There is an optional lab that takes a look at the changes of the plant communities as a ecosystem goes through succession. So if this doesn't make sense, if you don't remember this from biology, maybe take a look at that. Also, if you access these PowerPoints on Google Site or on our Blackboard account, this link here should take you to a Bozeman video that does a good job summarizing it as well. So if you just need a little bit extra with this, then please do take a look at that and make sure you ask me any questions that you might have.